Beloved one. They thought your silence meant surrender. They mistook your calm for defeat. While they were whispering your name in rooms you weren't in, they were certain of one thing, that you would stay quiet forever. They believed that the absence of your reaction meant the absence of your awareness. And in their minds, silence was the safest outcome for them, because silence meant the story could be controlled. Silence meant they could move freely without consequence. Silence meant they could write the narrative without interruption. But what they never understood is that silence does not always mean weakness. Sometimes silence is the most dangerous stage of transformation, because while others assume nothing is happening, everything is quietly rearranging beneath the surface. And this is the first truth you must understand, beloved one, your silence was never emptiness. It was preparation. It was the moment when pain stopped shouting and wisdom began observing. While they were busy measuring power through noise, you were learning something deeper, the strength that comes from watching, listening, and allowing truth to reveal itself naturally. The ones who underestimated you relied on a very common human assumption. Psychology has studied this pattern for years. In behavioral observation studies, researchers have found that nearly 68% of people interpret quiet behavior as weakness or lack of awareness. They assume that if someone is not reacting, confronting, or defending themselves, that person must be unaware of what is happening. But the truth is almost the opposite. Silence often belongs to the most observant mind in the room. Think about the moments you said nothing. The conversations you walked away from. The arguments you refused to join. To some people, that looked like retreat. But inside you, something else was happening. You were gathering patterns. You were noticing tone changes. You were watching how certain people behaved when they believed you weren't paying attention. Silence gave you a vantage point that noise never could. Because when people believe they are unobserved, they begin to reveal themselves without realizing it. Their words become looser. Their actions become more careless. Their intentions slowly step out from behind the masks they usually wear. And the remarkable thing is this, your silence changed the environment around you in ways they never expected. When someone stops reacting, manipulators lose their script. When someone refuses to argue, gossip begins to collapse on its own weight. When someone quietly heals instead of retaliating, the people who depended on chaos begin to feel something they didn't anticipate, uncertainty. Because your silence removed the battlefield they were prepared to fight on. They were expecting confrontation, but you gave them observation. They were expecting emotional reaction, but you gave them distance. And that shift forced their true nature to surface. You may not have realized it at the time, but what you entered was a powerful phase that many people experience during personal transformation. Psychologists often refer to it as the observer phase of recovery, a period where individuals step back emotionally and begin processing situations without immediate reaction. Studies suggest that over 70% of people undergoing deep emotional healing naturally move into this quiet observation stage, where they reassess relationships, patterns, and environments before making their next move. It's not weakness. It's recalibration. It's the mind reorganizing its understanding of reality. And that is exactly where you were, beloved one. While others were trying to provoke you into reacting, you were unknowingly stepping into a position of clarity. You were seeing who celebrated your absence. You were seeing who exaggerated stories. You were seeing who suddenly grew comfortable speaking about you when they thought you would never respond. In their minds, the chapter had already been closed. They believed the silence meant the final word had already been spoken. But what they didn't realize is that silence is not always the end of a story. Sometimes silence is simply the pause before truth enters the room. Look at history, look at human behavior, look at everyday life. The loudest voices often dominate the moment, but the quiet observer often understands the entire situation. The person who reacts immediately is fighting the surface battle. The person who pauses is studying the entire war. And without realizing it, you were doing something that unsettled people more than confrontation ever could. You were removing your energy from the drama they depended on. And when energy disappears, so does control. That is why some of them have become uncomfortable lately. Something about your silence has changed. It no longer feels like avoidance to them. It feels like awareness. They can sense that you are no longer confused. They can feel that you are no longer reacting the way you once did. And that shift alone has begun to disturb the narrative they were once so confident in. But here is the part they never planned for, beloved one. Silence does something very strange to the truth. The longer truth waits, the heavier it becomes. The longer deception continues, the more careless the deceivers become. And the longer someone believes they have gotten away with something, the more openly they reveal the very thing they were trying to hide. And that is why something is beginning to change around you now. Because what they did while you were silent is slowly becoming impossible for them to hide. And the moment you fully see it, everything they thought was buried will begin to surface. Beloved one, there is something you must understand about this moment you are standing in right now. What you believed was simply a quiet chapter of your life was actually a revealing season. You thought you were just stepping back to find peace, to breathe, to heal from the confusion and the noise around you. But something far deeper was happening behind the scenes. In this message, you are about to understand 3 things that many people never realize until it is too late. Why your silence unsettled them more than confrontation ever could, what mistake they made when they believed you were unaware, and why the truth surrounding you is beginning to surface naturally without you forcing it. Because what looked like nothing on the surface was actually a silent rearrangement of power. The people around you were making calculations based on an assumption that turned out to be completely wrong. They believed silence meant safety. They believed if you were not reacting, questioning, or challenging anything, then their actions would remain comfortably hidden. But the strange thing about human behavior is that when people believe there are no consequences, their true nature slowly begins to appear. And this brings us to the first revelation. When someone stays silent for a long time, their enemies begin to feel comfortable. Comfort is one of the most dangerous emotions for someone who is hiding something. The moment a person believes they are no longer being watched, their caution begins to fade. This is a pattern psychologists have observed repeatedly in behavioral studies. When individuals believe scrutiny has disappeared, their behavior becomes more relaxed, less controlled, and often more revealing. In fact, several social behavior studies suggest that people are nearly 60% more likely to reveal their real intentions when they feel there is no immediate challenge or resistance. And this is exactly what happened around you. When you stopped arguing, some people started speaking more freely. When you stopped explaining yourself, others began building stories to fill the silence. When you stopped defending your character, those who benefited from misunderstanding you began to feel bold enough to shape the narrative however they wanted. To them, your silence was permission. It felt like a green light. But what they didn't realize is that comfort can be deceptive. Because while they were relaxing their guard, something else was quietly happening. You were seeing patterns. That leads to the second revelation. Quiet people are rarely unaware. In most cases, they are observing far more than anyone realizes. Silence changes perception. When someone stops talking, they begin noticing details others overlook. Tone shifts. Facial reactions. The difference between what someone says publicly and what they say privately. Researchers studying social dynamics often point out that individuals who speak less during conflict situations tend to gather significantly more environmental information than those who dominate conversations. Their minds are not busy defending themselves, so they begin absorbing everything around them. And many times, beloved one, this observation happens almost subconsciously. You may not have been intentionally studying anyone. You were simply protecting your peace. But in that quiet space, something remarkable occurred. You began to see who checked on you sincerely and who only approached you when they wanted information. You began to notice who tried to provoke reactions and who seemed strangely disappointed when you didn't respond. You started recognizing patterns in behavior that once felt confusing. Think about a simple real-life example. Imagine a workplace where someone spreads subtle rumors about a colleague. If that colleague immediately reacts with anger and confrontation, the situation becomes chaotic. The focus shifts away from the truth and toward the emotional reaction. But if that same person chooses silence and observation instead, something very different happens. Over time, the one spreading the rumors becomes comfortable. They repeat the behavior. They exaggerate the story. They say slightly different versions to different people. And eventually the inconsistencies begin to appear. People start noticing the contradictions. Not because the silent person exposed them, but because their own comfort exposed them. And that is what many people fail to understand about silence. Silence is not passive. Silence is often the environment where truth reveals itself without being forced. While they were expecting resistance, you gave them space. While they expected arguments, you gave them distance. And in that distance, their real intentions slowly stepped into the light. Some of them still don't realize it yet. They believe the story they built is still intact. They assume the quiet chapter means the situation has already passed. But something subtle has begun to shift. The same silence they once interpreted as weakness now feels different. Now it feels like awareness. Now it feels like distance. Now it feels like you have understood more than they ever intended you to see. And that feeling is beginning to make certain people uneasy. Because deep down they know something that they don't want to admit. Truth has a strange way of surfacing when people become careless. And what they revealed when they thought you weren't watching exposed something even they didn't realize. Beloved one, there is something about human nature that many people try to hide, yet it quietly reveals itself over time. No matter how carefully someone chooses their words, no matter how cleverly they attempt to manage their image, the truth has a strange habit of slipping through patterns. People may control a single moment, but they rarely control repeated behavior. And this brings us to the next revelation that explains why the atmosphere around you has begun to change. People eventually confess themselves through patterns. Not through dramatic confessions. Not through sudden apologies. But through repetition. Through the same tone that appears again and again. Through the same small actions that quietly repeat themselves until they form a clear picture. Psychologists who study interpersonal behavior have long noticed this phenomenon. When individuals are hiding intentions or maintaining a false narrative, they can manage their behavior temporarily. But maintaining a false identity over time requires constant mental effort. And eventually, cracks appear. Research in behavioral psychology shows that when people feel pressure to maintain a story, their repeated behaviors begin revealing the truth behind that story. In other words, the more someone tries to protect an image, the more their natural tendencies begin to leak through their patterns. It might show up as contradictions in their words. It might appear in the way they react when certain topics arise. It might even surface in how they treat different people depending on who is watching. And this is something you slowly began noticing during your silence. At first, it may have felt like small observations. Little moments that seemed unimportant. A strange reaction here. An exaggerated story there. A person who spoke one way in public but differently when the room changed. None of it seemed like clear evidence on its own. But over time, those moments began forming a pattern. And once a pattern appears, it becomes very difficult to ignore. That leads to the next revelation. Your silence didn't hide the truth. It forced the truth to expose itself. You see, when someone is challenged directly, they often become defensive. They deny. They redirect the conversation. They create distractions. Conflict becomes smoke that hides the real issue. But when confrontation disappears, the smoke disappears too. And suddenly the behavior itself becomes visible. Your silence removed the distraction. While others expected you to argue, you chose to observe. While they prepared their defenses, there was no attack to defend against. And in that strange quiet space, something unexpected happened. The people who were comfortable in chaos suddenly had nothing to push against. Without resistance, their actions began to stand alone, visible and unfiltered. And the more comfortable they became, the more careless their patterns grew. This is exactly why many social behavior studies show that people under psychological pressure tend to reveal their true intentions through repeated behavioral patterns. When someone believes they must constantly maintain control over a narrative, the mental strain builds slowly. Eventually their actions begin speaking louder than their explanations. And beloved one, that is when the shift began. At first it was gossip. Whispers that traveled through conversations. Half-truths wrapped inside confident voices. Stories that were told as if they were facts. For a while, those whispers seemed powerful. Gossip often thrives when the person being talked about is not present to respond. It creates a temporary illusion of control. But gossip has a weakness. It needs constant energy to survive. When the person being targeted refuses to react, gossip slowly begins transforming into something else. Fear. Because the storytellers suddenly realize something unsettling. The person they were speaking about is no longer participating in the drama. They are not defending themselves, but they are not collapsing either. They are simply continuing forward quietly. And that quiet strength creates a new question in the minds of those who were once confident. What if they know? That single thought changes everything. The tone shifts. The confidence fades. The conversations become more careful. People who once spoke boldly begin watching their words. And sometimes, the very people who created the story begin contradicting themselves while trying to maintain it. Then comes the next stage. Manipulation. When fear begins replacing confidence, some people try to regain control by shifting the narrative again. They attempt to rewrite the story before the truth becomes obvious. They might act suddenly friendly. They might attempt subtle influence over how others perceive you. They might even pretend the past never happened. But here is the strange thing about manipulation. It often exposes itself faster than honesty. Because manipulation requires strategy, and strategy leaves patterns. The more someone tries to control perception, the more visible their intentions become to anyone who is calmly observing. And this is the moment where everything begins to turn. The same silence they once celebrated is now unsettling them. The same distance they once interpreted as weakness now feels like awareness. And the same patterns they believed no one noticed are quietly revealing more than they ever intended. You may not have confronted them. You may not have exposed them publicly. But the truth surrounding their behavior has begun speaking on its own. And that realization is beginning to spread through the environment around you. Because when patterns become visible, people start connecting the dots. Conversations change. Perspectives shift. And suddenly the narrative that once seemed solid begins developing cracks. Yet here is the most surprising part of all. The reason some of them are nervous right now has nothing to do with a confrontation they expect. It has nothing to do with an argument they fear. And it certainly has nothing to do with a reaction they believe might come. No. The real reason they are nervous right now has nothing to do with what you said, beloved one. By now you may have started noticing something unusual in the way people interact with you. The atmosphere around you does not feel exactly the same anymore. The same individuals who once felt comfortable speaking over you, dismissing you, or shaping the story around you now behave with a different kind of caution. It may be subtle, but the shift is real. And the reason for that shift is not because you suddenly became louder. It is because you became clearer. There is a quiet form of authority that does not come from dominance or confrontation. It comes from inner alignment. When a person stops chasing approval, stops defending themselves in every conversation, and begins standing calmly in their truth, something powerful happens. Their presence alone begins to communicate something others can feel but cannot easily explain. This is what many people call quiet authority. And this is where your identity begins to change. Some people believe strength must always be loud. They think power must always be proven through arguments, through constant explanations, through visible displays of control. But the deeper truth is something very different. Some people talk to prove strength. Chosen ones move quietly, and reality proves it for them. You did not need to chase every rumor to expose it. You did not need to challenge every misunderstanding to reveal the truth. Instead, you stepped into a different energy. One where your actions, your growth, and your consistency quietly spoke for themselves. And when someone begins operating from that level of calm power, the environment around them begins to adjust automatically. People feel it. They sense that the person standing before them is no longer operating from insecurity or emotional reaction. The same tactics that once triggered responses suddenly stop working. The manipulation that once created confusion suddenly meets silence and clarity instead. And that is when many manipulators begin losing their advantage. Psychological research on emotional manipulation has revealed something fascinating. Studies observing interpersonal control patterns suggest that nearly 72% of manipulative dynamics collapse once the target stops reacting emotionally to provocation. In simple terms, manipulation depends on emotional fuel. When someone refuses to supply that fuel, the strategy begins to fall apart. And beloved one, whether you realized it or not, that is exactly what you started doing. Look at real-life situations around you. In workplaces, this pattern happens every day. Imagine someone who spreads subtle criticism about a coworker behind closed doors. They expect that coworker to become defensive, to argue, to escalate the tension. But when that coworker instead focuses quietly on their work, improves their performance, and refuses to engage in the drama, something interesting happens. Over time, the person spreading negativity begins to look less credible. The contrast becomes visible. One person is producing results, while the other is producing noise. The truth exposes itself through behavior. Or think about family dynamics. Sometimes manipulation appears in the form of guilt, pressure, or emotional control. A family member may attempt to influence decisions through subtle criticism or by questioning your choices repeatedly. When someone reacts emotionally every time, the cycle continues. But when that person begins responding calmly, setting quiet boundaries, and refusing to argue endlessly, the manipulative strategy begins to lose its grip. The emotional leverage disappears. And then there are friendships. Perhaps you once had people around you who enjoyed your presence as long as you remained predictable, always available, always explaining yourself, always participating in conversations about others. But when you began protecting your peace, when you stopped engaging in unnecessary drama, when you quietly distanced yourself from negativity, some of those friendships began to reveal their true foundation. The ones built on sincerity remained. The ones built on convenience or gossip slowly faded away. This is not punishment. This is alignment. When a person grows internally, their environment begins reorganizing around that growth. The relationships that resonate with the new version of you remain strong. The ones that depended on your old patterns begin to dissolve naturally. And this is why the energy around you feels different now. You are no longer the same person who entered the situation months or years ago. The version of you that once reacted quickly, that once tried to correct every misunderstanding, that once carried the emotional weight of other people's opinions, that version has evolved. In its place stands someone calmer. Someone more observant. Someone who understands that truth does not always need immediate defense. That calmness is what unsettles people the most. Because calm power is difficult to manipulate. When someone stands quietly in their clarity, manipulation loses its grip. Gossip loses its impact. And those who depended on confusion begin feeling something they cannot control. Uncertainty. They start wondering if their actions have already been seen. They begin questioning whether the narrative they built still holds together. They start sensing that the person they once underestimated now understands far more than they expected. And sometimes that realization arrives suddenly. A single moment where they notice your calm response. A moment where they realize you are no longer reacting the way you used to. A moment where they see that their old tactics no longer move you emotionally. That is when the shift becomes undeniable. Because the moment someone recognizes that they can no longer control your reactions, they also realize something else: they can no longer control the story. And the moment they realized you no longer react the same way, something shifted. Beloved one. There comes a moment in every transformation where a person must decide what kind of power they will carry forward. Not the power that comes from revenge, not the kind that feeds on proving others wrong, but the deeper power that comes from alignment. Alignment is when your actions, your peace, and your understanding begin moving in the same direction. And when that alignment happens, something remarkable unfolds. You stop fighting battles that were never meant to define you. You see, many people believe justice must always arrive through confrontation. They imagine that truth only appears when someone exposes every lie or challenges every accusation. But life often works in a quieter, more revealing way. When someone grows beyond the chaos that surrounded them, the truth begins surfacing on its own. People start comparing behaviors. Patterns become visible. Conversations change tone. The same individuals who once felt powerful within confusion suddenly find themselves standing inside the very consequences they created. This is why choosing peace is not weakness. Peace is clarity. When a person carries peace, they are no longer reacting from wounded pride or emotional pressure. They are responding from understanding. And that understanding allows them to move forward without becoming trapped inside the very drama that tried to hold them back. Some people expected you to spend your energy proving yourself. They assumed you would chase every rumor, defend every misunderstanding, and spend endless time correcting the opinions of people who had already decided what they wanted to believe. But instead of doing that, you chose something far more powerful. You chose growth. And growth is the one thing manipulation cannot control. The more you focused on healing, the more your mind became clearer. The more you stepped away from chaos, the more your environment began reorganizing itself naturally. Some relationships strengthened. Others quietly faded. Some people began respecting your boundaries. Others became uncomfortable with them. But every change pointed to the same reality. You were moving forward. And that movement is what unsettled those who thought the story was already finished. Because in their minds, silence meant the chapter had closed. They believed the narrative they created would remain untouched. They assumed the quiet phase of your life meant the final word had already been spoken. But something they never predicted happened. You didn't return with anger. You returned with clarity. And clarity is far more powerful than confrontation. Because clarity does not need to shout. It does not need to argue. It simply exists, and the truth surrounding it begins arranging itself naturally. Over time, people notice who remained consistent and who relied on distortion. They observe who carried integrity and who relied on manipulation. And slowly, quietly, the difference becomes impossible to ignore. So understand this final message, beloved one. The people who once feared your voice misunderstood the real transformation that was happening inside you. They believed their greatest threat would be your reaction, your confrontation, your attempt to expose them directly. But they were wrong. The real shift that changed everything was your growth. Your healing. Your refusal to remain trapped inside their narrative. Because once a person grows beyond manipulation, the very foundation of manipulation begins to crumble. And the ones who depended on that foundation begin realizing something unsettling. The person they once tried to silence is no longer playing the same game. That realization is what makes them uneasy now. Not because you shouted. Not because you exposed them. But because you evolved. And when someone evolves beyond the environment that once tried to contain them, the truth eventually becomes visible to everyone watching. So move forward with peace, not resentment. Carry wisdom, not bitterness. The purpose of this season was never to trap you in anger, it was to reveal the difference between who you were and who you were always meant to become. And if this message reached you at the exact moment you needed clarity, take a quiet moment to support this channel. Messages like this are meant to reach the people who almost allowed their voices to disappear, the ones who were nearly convinced that silence meant defeat. Sometimes a simple like or subscribing helps these messages travel further than we realize, reaching others who may be standing in the same quiet transformation you once stood in. Because the truth is, beloved one. The moment someone stops trying to control the story and begins living the truth, everything begins shifting around them. And the moment they realize you finally understand everything, they will wish you were still silent.